All right, folks, here we go. Here's the challenge. You're going to a desert island unexpectedly, and you can only take one long box of comics with you. What are you going to take?
That's a tough call. I'm going to start with the ABC line by Alan Moore.
That's a lot of comics. I'd probably fill up the box, but we can allow you to cheat a little bit.
All
So
right.
just to be clear, that's Tom Strong, Tomorrow Stories,
Prometheus, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, I guess, is kind of part of that. So
top 10.
how do you forget top 10?
Yeah, I know. Okay, so my first pick in alphabetical order is All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison, Frank Quitely. It's probably the seminal Superman story. Quitely's art is what really sells it for me. I just couldn't live without that comic. What about you?
And that was on my list. So that's my next one on my list, All-Star Superman. I totally agree. It's like, to me, it's the epitome of a Superman story, what it should be.
Perfect. Okay, my number 2 is Animal Man by Grant Morrison and Chaz Truog. It's superheroes taken in the opposite direction of realism to the ultimate degree.
I agree. I mean, that's next on my list as well, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I knew our lists were going to be similar, but it's so good. Next on my list is Batman Year One by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. It's like a noir crime story with Batman. It's an origin story. It's simple, it's well told. Just one of my favorite Batman stories.
Dang, if I could amend my list, I would add that because that is probably my favorite Batman story. It's absolutely essential Batman reading. Okay, the next one on my list, number 3, is Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison and Richard Case. People don't usually think of this as a superhero story, but it really is a celebration of everything that was great about the crazy Silver Age DC and Marvel comics. And so it really is an underrated gem that not a lot of people know about. But I mean, what's your opinion? Is that on your list as well?
It is on my list as well. One of my all-time favorite books ever. Like, just is. It's weird. It's quirky. It's smart. It's bizarre. But it makes complete sense. It's heartbreaking at times. Just such a good book.
And also great characters. There's some really good moments between, especially Robot Man and Crazy Jane. Like, there's some real bonds there. It's a great series.
Yeah. Next on my list, because I have to put one of my favorite artists ever on the list, DC New Frontier by Darwin Cook. It's just everything that's essential to a Silver Age superhero book. It's the essence of it, right? So
I want to give props to Darwin Cook for restoring the nobility of Hal Jordan, as well as many other of those superheroes. I'm with you on that one. Okay, I'm pretty sure this is not on your list. G.I. Joe by Larry Hama. Not usually considered a critical favorite, but millions of kids like me grew up on G.I. Joe and were introduced to comics because of it, and I found it to be endlessly rereadable. And I think what Larry Hama brought to the table, because he wasn't really considered a writer at the time, he was an editor. What he brought to the table was his own experience in the military, and I think he brought something to that comic that no other writer could have brought. And for that reason, I recommend it. G.I. Joe by Larry Hama.
I'll have to take your word for it because I think I've read one G.I. Joe comic my whole life. I never hardly ever watched the cartoon. It was one of those things that went completely past me as a kid. So
Understandable. But one day, maybe.
One day. Next on my list, and I'm pretty sure it's not on yours either. I mean, it may be. I just don't get that vibe. Elektra Assassin by Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz. It's like a very mature take on the Elektra character with some of the nicest painted artwork by Bill Sienkiewicz you'll ever see. Frank Miller, when he was at his peak as a writer, it's just a beautiful, beautiful book.
Okay, number 5 on my list, Daredevil Born Again by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. It is endlessly rereadable. It almost feels like you're watching Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese. It's just so realistic. It's back to that idea in the 80s of what would these characters be like if they existed in reality. The last 2 issues go a little bit outside of that with when they bring in the Avengers, but otherwise it made me a fan of Matt Murdock. It made me a fan of Daredevil and his powers. It made me a fan of Frank Miller. I can't say enough about this comic. Are you a fan?
A big fan. It actually would have been on my list. I don't want to say I forgot it, but it just, when you can only fit so much in that one box. No list would be complete without Sandman for me, by Neil Gaiman and Mike Dringenberg and Kelly Jones and Sam Keith, Charles Vess. It's just one of my all-time favorite books, and hard to describe though. It's just about everything. It's about life. It's about it's a horror book. It's a fantasy book. It's just, he draws so much from literature. It's a brilliant book.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. The next one on my list is mostly on there because of the art. The story is also good, but no list would be complete without a Jack Kirby comic, and I picked New Gods by Jack Kirby. This to me is the peak of superhero comic book art, if not comic book art itself. He helped develop the language, and this is Jack Kirby at his peak in the early 70s. Absolutely essential for anyone who's a fan of the art form. Are you a fan of New Gods?
You know, I've never been a big fan simply because I haven't read much of it. But Kirby's art from that period is absolutely gorgeous and full of energy.
Yeah.
So I'll put it on my list.
Sure. All right. Okay, so what's next on your list?
Next on my list, I have to go with Alan Moore again. V for Vendetta. I mean, the movie is very good, but the book is just, it's very British in its feel, but at the same time, it's so well crafted. The art by David Lloyd is perfect, very dark and gritty for the series, which fits it perfectly.
Yep. I agree. The next on my list, this is essential superhero reading. Okay, folks? Alan Moore, Chris Sprouse, and others. Supreme. Absolutely. Like, if you love superheroes, if you love Superman, this is the way. It's almost like an alternate history. This is how superhero comics should be in the 21st century. They're not, but he figured out a way to do it in a completely different way than everyone else. What do you think of Supreme?
I love Supreme, and now I'm mad that you put it on your list and I forgot to put it on mine. It's everything that should be right about Superman. Right? It's fun, it's witty, it's clever.
And endlessly rereadable, right?
Absolutely.
My next one is another comic by Alan Moore and Chris Sprouse, which you already touched on. It's Tom Strong. I could have listed all the ABC comics, but Tom Strong is the one that I find myself going back to over and over again for the same reasons that I mentioned about Supreme. Again, it's Silver Age feel but with a modern vibe, with more intelligent, right?
Yep.
More sophisticated. And again, just like Supreme, he figured out a way to do superheroes the way they should be done that unfortunately no one is doing.
The art by Sprouse is stunning, clean, and you're right. It's just fun comics the way they should be.
Another comic that I'm positive is not on your list of comics you bring to a desert island, Transformers by Bob Budiansky and collaborators. I'm not going to say this comic is as good as G.I. Joe, but again, this is another comic where it's maybe because I've read it so many times, but as I go back and read it again in 2016, the contrast between the Bronze Age comics and the comics of today, the gap grows wider and wider and wider. So here you have a writer, Bob Budiansky, I believe is how you pronounce it. He was working under the discipline of Marvel Comics of the day, which was mainly Jim Shooter. You have a done-in-one story in every issue. You have interesting characters. You have, people plotting against each other. And you have a clear story where you're interested in finding out what happens next. And you have great art by people like William Johnson, Don Perlin, a Marvel veteran, and then later on Jose Delbo, who's mainly known for doing Supergirl, right? Again, Jose Delbo, not a name you see come up a lot among critics and fans. But again, you look at it, you go, wow, every panel is its own piece of art. Every panel has its own composition. And so for that reason, again, is it a great comic? Maybe not. But it's a relic from a time when I think all comics were better in a way.
Well, I have nothing to say. I've never been a Transformers fan, so I'll have to take your word for it again.
What if I gave you the best issue? Would you read it?
Yes,
Awesome.
of course.
Okay, what's next on your list?
I get a feeling it's probably going to be the same one that's on your list since we haven't touched on it yet.
Okay.
But it's Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons.
You know what? And the thing about Watchmen is that we've said so much about it that all I can say is this. Are there flaws in Watchmen? Yes. But, I mean, complaining about flaws in Watchmen is like complaining the pyramids don't have air conditioning. It's such a monumental piece of work that the fact that there's tiny little things that maybe aren't as good as the other parts, especially when it came out in 1985, it was leagues above everything else. Even to this day, there's hardly a comic that's matched it, and that's why DC continues to go back to it and strip mine it, right?
Yeah, it's hard to judge it by today's standards because it was so influential. But yeah, I mean, it does have flaws. But like you said, for the time it came out, there was nothing else like it. And there's really been, I really don't know if there's anything that's really topped it since. So
I don't think there is. I don't think anything is topped Watchmen. I agree with you on that. Here we go, folks. So there you go. Those are 10 comics from each of us that we would bring in a long box with us to a desert island. I would say that you watching as a viewer, you see how many of our choices overlapped, and I think those are some good places to start. Because I think a lot of people, if you were to ask them which comics they would bring to desert island, a lot of our choices would be on that list, don't you think?
Oh, I think so. I think they're pretty much standard picks for most people.
So here we go, folks. Here's the challenge to you if you're watching. Please, if you're watching on YouTube, post below in your comments your 10 comic series you would take with you to a desert island. And if you're watching on TV, just feel free to give us a call, write to your congressman, however you want to communicate that to us. And we can all celebrate in our favorite comics. There you go.